Let's try this one more time. Alright, so I started this thing, and then what happens? My computer crashes. So here we go again. Let's try this module one more time. How's the United States able to win World War II? Today we're going to take a look at the war, how the United States is going to win this thing, and what it's actually going to do for America. Focus question for you. How did the fighting in World War II help do two things? End the Great Depression and establish the United States as the largest world superpower at the same time. What? How can a war do that? Remember, we talked about World War II is a turning point. Turning point in world history, turning point in American history. This is going to be our coming out part. This is going to be the war that establishes us as the great granddaddy of the world powers. The Spanish-American War is our coming out party. World War I is where we show that we can play alongside the big boys. World War II is going to make us the big boy. Okay, so let's take a look and see how this is going to happen. In order to understand World War II, let's take a look at a map of the world. Okay, so where's the war going to be fought? War is going to be fought here in Europe. War is going to be fought in North Africa. War is going to be fought in China. War is going to be fought in Korea, Japan, all these islands in the Pacific. War is going to be fought over here in Southeast Asia. The war is going to be fought basically everywhere in the Eastern Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, where the United States is located, is going to be largely left alone due to geography. Of course, the one exception to this is going to be Pearl Harbor, which is Hawaii, but that's not the mainland of the United States. What does that mean? The United States is going to be sending troops, it's going to be sending materials to the rest of the world, but it itself is not going to be directly involved with, is not going to be fighting on our home turf. That is a huge advantage, because when everybody over here is bombing the crap out of everybody else, what are some of the big targets? The biggest targets are going to be the factories that produce the materials and the weapons needed to fight the war. Who isn't having their factories bombed? That would be us. Our factories are going to be gearing up to 100%, churning out materials and weapons and food and everything that's going to be needed to fight this war in Europe, in Asia, and everywhere else that it needs to be fought. So we have a huge advantage in those regards. So I want you to keep that in mind as we jump in and take a look. So we're taking a look, how's the United States able to win the war? Tehran, Iran, 1943. Big three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the leaders of the Allied powers by 1942, which were Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, are going to meet for the first time. They decide on a strategy known as Europe First. So, yes, the United States is involved with Japan. Shortly after the United States declares war on Japan, 3 days, as a matter of fact, Germany declared war on the United States. So the United States is involved in this war. We get into an agreement in Tehran where we decide to put the bulk of our armed forces into the European theater. We decide to help defeat the Nazis first, because we see the Nazis as the greater of the threats to world peace. So we agree to take out the Nazis first, and then after that we will shift the bulk of our forces over to the Pacific to fight the Japanese. We also enlist the help of Stalin in this. Stalin agrees that within 3 months of the defeat of Germany, that he will commit forces to the Pacific, and that's going to have bigger consequences as we get into 1945 and the end of the war, and that's going to play a role in Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in order to end the war quickly, because we are afraid that Stalin is going to try to take more land as he did in Eastern Europe. So let's jump right in. Okay, so the Europe First strategy. Japan, things are not going to be moving as fast in the Pacific. We were fighting basically island to island. Most of our Most of our aviators are going to be sent to China, but we start going island to island, start fighting. This is mainly going to be a naval and an air war in Japan. What we do is we take the bigger islands and we try to starve out the smaller islands, known as island hopping. If we tried to take every single island that Japan controlled, it would have taken us forever, and it would cause so many casualties. So the idea is you take the big islands, and the islands that are in between Japan and us are going to be starved out, and they're going to surrender. That's what we were doing. Battle of Midway in 1942 is going to be the big turning point. Here you can take a look at what the fighting looked like in the Pacific Theater. The aircraft carrier is going to be established in World War II as the big naval ship. Back during World War I and before that, it was the battleship, the big gunships that were the most important for the Navy. During World War II, it's going to be established that the aircraft carrier is going to be, because the reality of the warfare has changed. So this is a naval and air war that's really going to be fought in Japan. And at first, the Japanese were kicking our butts, but in June 1942, we're able to take the Battle of Midway. And that's going to allow us to start to turn the tide against the Japanese in the Pacific, and we're going to begin island hopping, going from island to island. And by June of 1944, American carriers were launching bombing raids on Japanese home islands. So it was taking us some time, but we got closer and closer. All right, so let's go to Hitler. Let's go to Germany. Hitler basically controlled all of mainland Europe, and he was able to fortify the crap out of it. So it was going to be very hard for us to invade, even though Stalin wanted us to invade very fast. So what we decided to do is we thought we had to start pushing back on Hitler's strategic advantages and to start bombing the crap out of him, so that we could soften up Europe in preparation for invading. There were U-boats in the Atlantic. Basically, we were convoying, and we beefed up our destroyers to be able to try to take those over. And then we focused, once we got superiority over the oceans, we started getting superiority over the air in Europe. We started systematically going after German air forces, and then once we took out the German air forces, we're able to start carpet bombing the Europe. We sent huge convoys of bombers. These are B-17s, and they would just release millions of tons of ordnance on European cities and targets, and we just leveled entire cities in Europe. North Africa is going to be the first major point of invasion. We invaded North Africa because we wanted to cut off Hitler's strategic supply of oil. So we were fighting across Africa from most of 1942 and 1943, trying to end the strategic battle on the land. These are going to be giant tank battles that are going to be fought between George Patton and Erwin Rommel. These are legendary generals from World War II on the German and American side. And then let's see, I talked about Tehran. Tehran, it was also decided that we had to invade. We had to open up the second front. It took a long time for that second front to get open. The second front is not going to be opened for another almost 2 years. It's not going to be until June 1944, June 6, 1944, that we actually invade Europe and open the second front. And that's going to happen June 6, 1944, with the D-Day invasion of Normandy. D-Day invasion of Normandy is the largest amphibious invasion ever in ever in human history. We commit nearly 3 million soldiers to this thing. Designed special landing craft to go. We invaded Normandy. We actually built like a fake army with inflatable tanks and everything to try to confuse Hitler, to make him think that we were going to invade someplace else, the Pas-de-Calais. We actually invade Normandy. There's 5 different beachheads that are launched. It's the Americans, the Canadians, and the British. The Canadians were actually British citizens at that time. We launched the attack. The attack is going to be successful, and we're able to get a foothold into France. Once we're able to get a foothold into France, then you have the Americans and the British pushing in from the west onto Germany, and you have the Soviet Union is pushing in on the east. It was only going to be a matter of time until we were able to defeat Hitler. D-Day is going to be the big turning point of the war. Going in with this, you have the election in 1944 in November of 1944. It was basically a foregone conclusion at this time. FDR is running for his fourth term. He wasn't about to give up the reins of power just yet because the extraordinary circumstances that the country is going through. We talked about in the election in 1940, he decides to run for the unprecedented third term because the Great Depression and because the storm clouds were brewing in Europe. He thought that America needed really strong leadership and consistent leadership at that time. And he's going to run again, 1944. It's going to be his narrowest margin of victory, but he still is going to win handily over Thomas Dewey of New York. Just as an aside, people of this generation really looked at FDR as more than just a president, but really kind of like a savior figure. My grandmother was an Italian immigrant. Had very sparsely decorated walls, but there's two pictures, one facing the other one on different sides of the wall. On one wall you have a picture of Jesus because she was a good Catholic. On the other side you had a picture of FDR, and that's the way it was in the house. It was like you had Jesus, you had FDR. FDR was just admired as somebody who got the country through the Depression and through the war. I mean, he was a figure that was really deified in a lot of American households. Coincidentally, talk about a time that couldn't have been today. FDR, of course, had polio. He was confined to a wheelchair. His health was worsening, but the press didn't report about that stuff. More than anything, FDR cared about consistency, and he wanted to see the country stewarded through the war. Nobody really realized just how bad he was. He's going to die shortly after. He's going to die within the next 6 months. Okay, Hitler's days were numbered. So we start pushing in on both sides. December of 1944, Hitler launches a major counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. He basically takes everything he's got left and he launches at the Americans and the Germans. That did slow down the Americans and the British, allowing the Soviets to get to Berlin first. And the Soviets are going to capture Berlin in April of 1945. Hitler and the top Nazi brass are going to commit suicide April 30th, 1945. And once we are liberating Europe from the Nazis, we start to uncover all of the atrocities that Hitler's been committing in the Holocaust. There were rumors before, and we knew that he was no fan of the Jewish people, and there were rumors that this stuff was happening, but we didn't understand just how bad it was until we actually got to the camps and we started liberating the camps. Once we started liberating the camps, we realized that this was a systematic Holocaust that he was working on just senselessly killing the population of Europe's undesirables and Jewish, killing some 12 million people over the course of his reign of power, and about half of the Jewish population of Europe. Just a horrible story in human history, but this really kind of illuminated it for us. All right, so April 12th, 1945, just before Hitler, FDR is going to die from a massive stroke when he was on vacation in Warm Springs, Georgia. Basically, it had stressed the war and the Depression stressed him out so much that his body was weak to begin with, wasn't able to handle it. Harry Truman, his vice president, is going to be sworn in, and FDR did not keep Truman in the loop. So Truman's going to be coming in just as Europe is going to fall, and he's going to be stepping into some really big shoes. FDR had been the only leader the country had had for 12 years. He kept everything very close to the chest. He didn't let a lot of people know what he was doing. So now he's got the war to fight in Japan, and he's got to try to get this thing through. Now, Celebrating the end of the war in Europe, we have what's known as VE Day, for Victory in Europe Day. So it's sad that FDR is dying, but we also have the Victory in Europe, massive celebrations all over the country. This is the most famous picture on Life magazine here, taking Times Square, sailor coming home, taking the nurse and sweeping her off her feet. Okay, let's go back to Japan. So we are able to divert our forces fully to the fight in Japan, and the Japanese are not letting off. Basically, as we got closer and closer to Japan, the Japanese were just like recommitting themselves, and they were fighting hard. And as we got closer and closer to Japan, the fighting just got continually worse and worse. General MacArthur is going to be the main general in the Pacific Theater. This is him right here. He's going to recapture the Philippines in October of 1944 with a 250,000 man army. We firebombed the crap out of Tokyo, killing 83,000 people. We actually killed more people in the firebombing of Tokyo than we do with the nuclear weapons, which we're going to get to later. And we continue our island hopping, but as we continue with the island hopping, we hit more and more resistance. The Battle of Manila is going to cost us 60,000 dead. The Battle of Iwo Jima, which is a tiny little island, cost 4,000 dead, and it was a hard-fought battle. Okinawa cost 50,000 deaths, and that's in June of 1945. On top of that, as we got closer and closer, the Japanese started getting more and more desperate, so they started in with the suicide kamikaze attacks on American ships. Now, plans were drawn up for the invasion of Japan, and it was estimated that it would cause some 1 million casualties if we invaded Japan. So, President Truman is going to be briefed about a weapon that could potentially end the war faster. The Trinity tests in the New Mexican desert were successful from what was known as the Manhattan Project under the leadership of Dr. Robert Oppenheimer. And the United States, since the early days of the war, had begun quietly working on a nuclear weapon because we were afraid that the Nazis were already working on a weapon of this type. And it was seen as a vital interest of security that we had to have one just in case the Nazis were able to develop one. We were able to successfully develop one, and it was brought to Truman that we had these weapons. Now, the timeline is important because May of 1945 is when Europe ends. At the Tehran Conference, it was decided the Soviet Union would enter the war within 3 months the end of the war in Europe. So May, June, July, okay? The end of July, the beginning of August is when the Soviet Union was slated to commit coming into the war. Now, what had happened is the Soviets were not leaving what they had taken in Eastern Europe, and it was becoming clear that the next big threat is going to be the Soviet Union. So Truman is basically looking at it like this. He's worried about the Soviet Union expanding. He's worried about the Soviet Union coming in and taking more stuff. He's also worried that invading Japan is going to cost too many troops. He hears about this new weapon, and what he does is he orders he warns the Japanese to surrender, or we're basically going to use a weapon that nobody's ever seen before on you. The Japanese don't do it, so on August 6, 1945, Harry Truman ordered the use of the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Ends up killing some 180,000 people between the initial blast and the fallout afterwards. August 8, 1945, Stalin enters the war, quickly takes Korea. That's why North Korea is communist. And then August 9th, Truman orders the second bomb to be dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. 80,000 people are going to die. Japanese surrender on August 10th, 1945. The Japanese surrender is going to be known as VJ Day. The actual surrender took place on September 2nd, 1945. Here's General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz accepting the surrender of Japanese Emperor Hirohito. We actually allowed the Japanese to keep their emperor because in the Japanese religion the emperor is a god. That marks the end of World War II. We had won, but we suffered a lot. We suffered some, I don't know, 1 million from the war, but fewer deaths due to infection and penicillin. I think our total deaths were about 1 million casualties. Our total deaths going to be like 500,000 people. So we lose about 500,000 people. Still not as great as the Civil War. Civil War was some 650,000. World War II is about 450,000. Soviets are going to lose about 20 million people. Huge. That's going to set the ground for the Cold War. We're going to get into that. American homeland is going to be relatively untouched. Our industrial base is not going to be touched by the war. Huge. All those planes, all those tanks, everything that we needed was being produced, sent overseas. The rest of the world is going to have the crap bombed out of it. Our factories are still in production. Our factories are producing at 100%. Who's going to rebuild the world? We are. Guess who's going to make all that money? We are. That's right. Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. The soldiers are coming back to find work. There's work for everybody. 100% employment. Factories are going around the clock. People are making money. The Depression is ending. War is great for American business because all of those cities then need to be rebuilt. And then we need to go about to design a new world order where we and the Soviet Union are going to be the big dogs. So now, here it is. The United States of America is number one. We've gone from the pipsqueak country back in 1781 when we won the Revolutionary War to being lucky to hold on to our necks and our leaders, and now here we are, the biggest, most powerful country on the planet. Back to your focus question: how did the fighting in World War II help end the Depression and establish the United States as the world's largest superpower at the same time? Okay, people, I look forward to your responses. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.